On behalf of the National Archives and Records Administration, I welcome you to our Becoming America lecture series. This is the 5th of 18 lectures scheduled at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. As one of only 14 presidential libraries operated by the National Archives and Records Administration, the subject of how America came to be, how we gained and secured our freedom and created self-government is the essence of our mission. We believe that access to and education about our government allows Americans to understand their history so they can fully participate in shaping our future. This lecture is the brainchild of Dr. Jo Ellen Chatham, the director of the Center for Civics Education at Concordia University in Irvine. She and her colleagues have worked tirelessly to craft an educational and entertaining lecture series that we hope you will enjoy. Lectures will last 45 minutes with a question and answer format following. Please email me your questions at rachel.fisher@nara.gov, or if you're joining us in the audience today and have a question, please reach out to one of us. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Jo Ellen Chatham.
Thank you for joining us again. And once again, we'd like to thank the National Archives at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library. They've just been an enormous help on this series. So far, we've looked at our ancient British roots. We've looked at the problems leading up to the Revolutionary War. We've looked at the Articles of Confederation and why this country was so disunified. And tonight, we're going to hear a very interesting lecture on how the Constitution of the United States was ratified. Last lecture, we talked about the convention that wrote the Constitution, and I would encourage all of you to get your Constitution out and read it so that you really understand what the Constitution is about, and tonight you'll hear the difficulties we had in ratifying that document. Our lecturer this evening is Dr. Bryan Santin. He's a professor of English and political thought at Concordia University, Irvine. He earned his PhD at Notre Dame University, and he's recently written a book I encourage you to read. It's entitled Post-War American Fiction and the Rise of Modern Conservatism, A Literary History, 1945 to 2008. And he's currently the editor of a new book that is to come out next year, The Cambridge Companion to the 20th Century American Novel and Politics. So we'll hear a lot tonight, I'm sure, about language and politics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bryan Santin.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chatham. Thank you to the Nixon Library. Very excited to be here. So the title of my talk today, Ratifying the New Constitution, subtitled, Why Did Patriot Patrick Henry oppose ratification? So the ratification debate had to do with should the U.S. Constitution be ratified after the Constitutional Convention of 1787. This is a fascinating moment in American political history. Much of American political history, the fascinating moments have to do with war. They have to do with violence. Think of the Civil War, think of World War II, right? But this is a unique moment in which political discourse, political philosophy, political theory comes to the fore. So before we talk about those philosophical and theoretical aspects, first, we need to note the timeline. So, as I just said, the Constitutional Convention ends about mid-September 1787. September 28th, Congress agrees to present the Constitution to the states. Each state sets up a ratifying convention to debate the merits of the new Constitution. Now, if you look at the dates in which the ratification debate officially occurs, you notice it is not super long, right? It's a relatively short amount of time, especially considering how important it is philosophically So it takes place roughly between late November and end of June 1788. June 21st, New Hampshire becomes the 9th state to ratify the new Constitution, which is meeting the requirement that was established by Article 7 of the Constitution. And by July 2nd, Congress announces that the new Constitution has officially been adopted. So this is the basic timeline that you have to keep in mind. All of the debates that I'm going to be mentioning, the major issues surrounding ratification, are going to take place in a fairly short timeline. One way to think about the ratification debate, aside from the philosophical and theoretical issues, is to think about this peculiar figure, Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry is a famous radical patriot, right? One of the most famous founding fathers. In 1775, as the American Revolution is becoming particularly violent, he famously says, "Give me liberty or give me death." But here's the thing, and here's what often surprises my students, is that this great, famous founder is against ratifying the U.S. Constitution. So he says in 1788, criticizing the Constitution, he says, "We are told that we need not fear because those in power, being our representatives, will not abuse the power we put in their hands. I am not well versed in history." He's clearly being ironic and modest here. "But I will submit to you, to your recollection, whether liberty has been destroyed most often by the licentiousness of the people or by the tyranny of rulers. I imagine, sir, you will find the balance on the side of tyranny." So here he's using that same fiery language, the vocabulary of the American Revolution, which is slavery, freedom, tyranny. But when he says tyranny here, he's not talking about the British Crown. He's talking about James Madison. He's talking about Alexander Hamilton. He's talking about the Federalists. This raises a question which we'll come back to at the end of the lecture. What does it mean to invoke the founders? You hear this often. People say, well, the founders believed X, right? Or the founders thought Y. When you hear that phrase, the founders, you need to ask yourself, which ones and when? Because they change, right? So first, just to give you a couple visual helpers here. The ratification debate breaks down according to two large groups. You have the Federalists on one side, and the Federalists want to ratify the Constitution as is, as it comes out of the Constitutional Convention. Then you have the Anti-Federalists, who can also be broken down into two subcamps. One are the reservationists. They would like the Constitution to be ratified if a Bill of Rights can be added. And then you have another group called the irreconcilables, who don't want to ratify the Constitution at all. So let's take a look first at the Federalists. Probably the three most famous Federalists today are the three authors of the Federalist Papers: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. The Federalist Papers are 85 essays that argue that Americans should support the new Constitution, and not just support it, but ratify it, make it law. Another visualization, this can help understand the contours of the debate. The Federalists are interested in federalism. So on one side, you have the federal government, and they will have certain delegated powers. Certain powers will be reserved to the states, and there will be some powers that are concurrent. Now you see up there codified, this idea is codified in the 10th Amendment. But note, and we'll come back to this later, the Federalists did not want to add amendments. it was the Anti-Federalists who wanted to add the amendments. So keep that in mind as we go. Slightly more detailed visual graph. If you look on the left, those are the delegated powers to the federal government. Most of the powers there are what the Articles of Confederation did poorly, right? So if you remember from previous lectures in this series, the Articles of Confederation set it up so that most taxes and most laws had to be unanimous. The states were essentially sovereign, and they had to unanimously vote in order to pass big things that were affecting the entire Confederation. Those are now placed on the side of the federal government. The states still have a variety of powers, and then you have some concurrent powers, like establishing courts, organizing and maintaining militias, certain kinds of taxation. It helps to understand the Federalists if you understand what are they afraid of and what are their platforms, their positions, their solutions. So one, the Federalists are afraid of the mob. If you think of Shays' Rebellion, happens 1786 into 1787, this really terrifies some of the Federalists, the people who are for the Constitution. This looks like a mob uprising. They're afraid of unstable government, rebellions, civil war, humiliation abroad. So what do they propose? A stronger central government, stronger than the Articles of Confederation. They are interested in cultivating a national identity. This is talked about in some of the previous lectures also in this series, in which there's not really a sense of a coherent American identity, right, decades before. And also commerce, business and trade. The Federalists want to strengthen the central government so that they can also strengthen commerce, strengthen the economy. So let's meet the Anti-Federalists. Some of the leading Anti-Federalists. Number one, as I said, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, and George Mason. So they argue against ratification of the new Constitution, especially if a Bill of Rights is not added. So what are the Anti-Federalists afraid of? They are afraid of tyranny. Think of the quote just from Patrick Henry. They are afraid of the special interests, the aristocracy, essentially the elite of society at the time. They are afraid that the Constitution is going to allow for excessive taxation of the people, that there's going to be an autocratic government. They routinely refer to the presidency as monarchical, as potentially tyrannical. So what do they propose? These are just a few. First, term limits. They note that there's a lack of term limits, particularly for the president, right? And we know that this is not remedied until after Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They are adamant about a Bill of Rights. They are adamant about protecting what they see as state sovereignty, sometimes called states' rights. And they are particularly supportive of agrarianism, farming, right, as opposed to the Federalists supporting this growth in commerce. Oh, there we go. So let's go through some of the major issues. There are a host of them, but I would like to focus on 5 major ones. And I don't have a prepared script for tonight, but when I teach this, I tell my students you have to get into the primary texts. You have to get into the primary documents. You have to savor the language, right? If you can understand how they wrote, how they sounded, you can understand how they're thinking. So first, Anti-Federalist paper comes out, Brutus number 1, in 1787. The major issue is the size of republics. He says, the opinion of the greatest men, and he's talking about political philosophers, but he's really talking about the French philosopher Montesquieu, and the experience of mankind are against the idea of an extensive republic. You cannot have a Republican, little r Republican form of government that is as big as the United States. And they look to history. He says, history furnishes no example of a free republic, anything like the extent of the United States. The Grecian Republic, so ancient Greece, were of small extent, so also was that of the Romans. Both of these, it is true, in the process of time extended their conquests over large territories, and the consequence was that their governments were changed from that of free governments to those of the most tyrannical that ever existed in the world. So the anti-federalists say, look at history. Look at how stable small republics have fallen. They fall when they get big. He says, the different parts of so extensive a country could not possibly be made acquainted with the conduct of their representatives. So here he's pointing out, if we have a large American republic, let me tell you what will happen. He says, nor be informed of the reasons upon which measures were founded. The consequence will be that they will have no confidence in their legislature, suspect them of ambitious views, be jealous of every measure they adopt, and will not support the laws they pass. So if you have a large republic, the people will be suspicious. They will of the legislature, of people in Congress. They will think that they are out of touch. They will think that they are strivers and climbers and way too ambitious, and that they do not have the real interest of the people, right? Often when my students first come into my classes, they're usually on the side of the Federalists without knowing why. They're pro-Constitution. Then we start reading some of the anti-Federalists, and they say, anti-Federalists have some interesting points. So Federalist number 10 by James Madison, probably the most famous, maybe only second to Federalist 51. He answers this in November 1787. He says, okay, first of all, we can agree that the violence of faction has always been the mortal disease of popular governments. So James Madison takes it to a whole new philosophical level of depth, right? He's like, let's not just talk about republics in history. Let's talk about the root issues of political instability, and that's faction. He says the causes of faction are sown into the nature of man. And by faction here, he means a small, mostly small, can be larger sometimes, group of people who are politically passionate, who often do not see the best in the other side, right? And will do whatever they can to stay in power, right? And who essentially do not recognize the legitimacy of others in the political arena. He says, okay, so what do you do about faction? We can cure the disease either by removing its causes, so we can remove the cause of why factions occur, or we can control for its effects. The big problem is that both of the ways that you remove factions are bad. How can you stop factions? How can you stop these angry, antagonistic political groups from always clashing against each other in a free society? Well, you could destroy the liberty essential to its existence. That's one thing you could do. He says you could give to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. And he says, these are both really bad solutions if you're interested in a republic, if you're interested in a free government. So we must control for the effects. How do you control for the effects? Madison takes the anti-federalists and turns them on their head. He says, you know what you need? A large republic. And the anti-federalists are stunned. Like, what are you talking about? He says, the smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party. And the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, And the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. Small societies have in-group loyalty, and they can oppress outsiders. They can oppress the unpopular. He says what the American Republic will do, it will extend the sphere. And this will be good. Why? Because you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. So if you have a variety of factions, if they are splintered, if they are fractured, then you have less of a likelihood of a majority coming together to oppress a smaller majority. Political theorists often say Madison hits on an insight, which is that he constructs the Constitution so that people do the right things for the wrong reasons. If you have a bunch of factions who are all disagreeing, they can check each other. As he famously says, ambition can check ambition. Not because of the goodness of their hearts, right? But because they want to check that other group. Next major issue, is Congress too powerful? The Anti-Federalists key in on the necessary and proper clause, which states that Congress will have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, so that's the delegated powers to Congress, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So Brutus number 5, 1787 at the end, he looks at this necessary and proper clause and says, well, that's really vague language. That looks like anything, right? He says, it is perhaps utterly impossible fully to define this power. The authority granted in the first clause can only be understood in its full extent by descending to all the particular cases in which a revenue can be raised. The number and variety of these cases are so endless as it were infinite, that no man living has as yet been able to reckon them up. So he's thinking, for instance, about the Commerce Clause. Can Congress regulate commerce? Yes. What does commerce mean? That's open to debate. And then they can also make laws that are necessary and proper that help them regulate commerce. He's saying, wait a minute, this is a Pandora's box. He says, if then the objects of this power cannot be comprehended, how is it possible to understand the extent of that power, which can pass all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying it into execution? It is truly incomprehensible. A case cannot be conceived of which is not included in this power. The Federalists are saying that the U.S. Congress will use the necessary and proper clause to make laws about more or less whatever they want. Patrick Henry has a famous quip. It almost sounds like poetic verse. He says, a wonderful and unheard of experiment it will be to give unlimited power unnecessarily. And he's playing on the necessary and proper clause there, right? Patrick Henry, quite the rhetorician. Hamilton answers him in Federalist 33. He says, what is a power but the ability or faculty of doing a thing? What is the ability to do a thing but the power of employing the means necessary to its execution? So he's saying here, look, if we can collect taxes, we can raise and collect taxes, we should also be able to make laws that are necessary and proper to that power. So presumably we should also be able to make laws about how taxes are collected, right? There's going to be a whole constellation of necessary and proper laws that surround each power. He says, what are the means to execute a legislative power but laws? What is the power of laying and collecting taxes but a legislative power or a power of making laws to lay and collect taxes? What are the proper means of executing such a power but necessary and proper laws? And then Hamilton says, But people still might be suspicious. Why do we do this? He says the answer is that it could only have been done for greater caution and to guard against all cavilling refinements and those who might hereafter feel a disposition to curtail and evade the legitimate authorities of the Union. The convention probably saw what it has been a principal aim of these papers to inculcate, that the danger which most threatens our political welfare is that the state governments will finally zap the foundations of the Union. So he says, we put it in there. The Federalists were interested in this clause because he doesn't want the states cavilling. He doesn't want them coming up with these small gripes so that they don't have to send taxes to the government, right? Or so that they're always trying to find little cracks in the Constitution. This is a clause that is a kind of insurance clause for the power of Congress. Issue 3, is the president too powerful? Anti-Federalist paper number 74. Check out the subtitle, The President as Military King. So the Anti-Federalists often used the language, as I said before, of the American Revolution. And when they saw a single executive in the presidency, they immediately reach for the vocabulary of tyranny and for the rhetoric of the revolution, which is invested in looking at a single executive equals a king, right? This constant conflation in the Anti-Federalist papers. So the writer here says, a conspiracy against the freedom of America, both deep and dangerous, has been informed by an infernal junto of demagogues. Talking about the Constitutional Convention. Sometimes in the Anti-Federalist papers, you get almost a conspiratorial rhetoric, right? This angry rhetoric from the middle and bottom of society, angry at the top of society. He says, our 13 free commonwealths, so he's, again, they're here using the language of the Articles of Confederation, the conception of a sovereign state, are to be consolidated into one despotic monarchy. Is not this position obvious? Right? That's that conspiratorial rhetoric that the Anti-Federalists love. Its evidence is intuitive, right? How do I know this? I just know. I feel it. Who can deny but the President General will be a king to all intents and purposes? And one of the most dangerous kind, too, a king elected to command a standing army. Thus, our laws are to be administered by this tyrant, for the whole, or at least the most important part of the executive department is put in his hands, right? So this is terrifying rhetoric. It's the rhetoric of the American Revolution. This is answered again by Hamilton, and this time in Federalist 69, and he says, whoa, whoa, whoa. This comparison between the President of the United States and the King of Britain is faulty, it is misleading. Either you are making this comparison because you are dishonest, Anti-Federalists, or you're making this comparison because you're ignorant and you haven't read the Constitution. He says, first of all, the president is to be elected for 4 years and is to be re-eligible as often as the people of the United States shall think him worthy of their confidence, right? So remember here, we still don't get the term limits, even in the Federalist defense of the presidency. In these circumstances, there is a total dissimilitude between him and a king of Great Britain, who is a hereditary monarch possessing the crown as a patrimony descendable to his heirs forever. So wait a minute, our president is elected for 4 years, and he has to go up for re-election every 4 years. There is not a hereditary monarchy in the United States. This is totally different. Another point, the president would be liable to be impeached, tried, and upon conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes or misdemeanors, removed from office, and would afterwards be liable to prosecution and punishment in the ordinary course of law. The person of the King of Great Britain is sacred and inviolable. There is no constitutional tribunal to which he is amenable, no punishment to which he can be subjected without involving the crisis of a national revolution. So he says, we have put a lot of power into the hands of the president. This position of the presidency will be invested with great power. But we have also inserted a kind of escape clause. If the president engages in treason, in bribery, in high crimes or misdemeanors, he can be impeached, removed from office, and not only removed, but also prosecuted. That's not happening in Britain. And if it does happen, it's going to be a national revolution, right? You're going to have a massive, destabilizing civil war. The last one, he says, sure, the president is to be commander-in-chief of the army and the navy. In this respect, his authority would be nominally the same with that of the King of Great Britain, but in substance much inferior to it. He says, yeah, the president, he's the commander-in-chief. He's going to have a lot of power militarily. At least nominally, in name only, he's going to have power very similar to the king. He says it would amount to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military naval forces. That of the British king extends to the declaring of war and to the raising and regulating of fleets and armies, all which, by the Constitution under consideration, would appertain to the legislature. So here he's invoking that idea of separated powers and relatedly of checks and balances. He says, yes, the president will be commander-in-chief, but he will not be in charge of raising the armies. He will not be in charge of financing the military. That will be with Congress, and that is a key difference with the British king. So essentially, Hamilton is saying this language of monarchy, this language that the president is some kind of tyrannical king, cannot be based on any honest reading of the text. Final, this is the one my students like to talk about, is SCOTUS, is the Supreme Court of the United States. Is that institution too powerful in the Constitution? Brutus 11 says the opinions of the Supreme Court, whatever they may be, will have the force of law, because there is no power provided in the Constitution that can correct their errors or can control their adjudications. From this court, there is no appeal. When the Supreme Court rules on something that is constitutional, that is what is constitutional. It says the judicial power will operate to effect in the most certain but yet silent and imperceptible manner what is evidently the tendency of the Constitution. I mean, an entire subversion of the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the individual states. The Supreme Court is a federal institution. In the anti-federalist mind, they are going to rule in favor of the federal government, and their word will reign supreme. So this federal institution is going to be making judgments that benefit the federal government. They're very terrified of this. Note that the Anti-Federalists do not mention the amendment process, which is a very striking omission. There we go. Federalist 78, Alexander Hamilton responds to this common Federalist or Anti-Federalist critique. He says, first of all, coming right out of the gate, he says, the Supreme Court is going to be the least dangerous branch to the political rights of the Constitution. Wow, why is that? It looks like Madison, remember, inverting the Anti-Federalist argument. Small republics are the safest. Big republics are bad. Madison, nope, turns it right upside down. This is exactly what Hamilton does too. He just totally inverts the argument of the Anti-Federalists. He says, why? Well, the judiciary, on the contrary, has no influence over either the sword or the purse. Who's the commander-in-chief? Who can legitimately wield violence? The president. Who has control over finance? Congress, right? He says, no direction either of the strength or of the wealth of the society, and can take no active resolution whatever. It may truly be said to have neither force nor will, but merely judgment, and must ultimately depend upon the aid of the executive arm even for the efficacy of its judgments. All the Supreme Court has, he says, is its own rhetorical legitimacy. It does not have the power to wield violence. It does not have the power to move money. All it has is its judgment. The Supreme Court, Hamilton is saying, is only as powerful as the commitment of the American people to the conception of constitutionalism. Finally, the Bill of Rights. I put the Federalists first here because they lose this argument. In Federalist 84, Hamilton argues in a very interesting, intricate, circuitous way that the Constitution does not need a Bill of Rights. And you see the last quote there. He says, the Constitution is a Bill of Rights. So when I introduce this in class and put it like that, students are often puzzled. What is he talking about? Because we do have a Bill of Rights, right? What's going on here? So first, he says you have to understand what a Bill of Rights is, how it originated. And he says, it's been several times truly marked that bills of rights are in their origins stipulations between kings and their subjects, abridgments of prerogative in favor of privilege, reservations of rights not surrendered to the prince. So he says, a conception of a Bill of Rights, originally, in Hamilton's view, is you have a king and then you have subjects, right? And he says, I go further and affirm that bills of rights, in the sense and in the extent in which they are contended for, are not only unnecessary in the proposed Constitution, but would even be dangerous. And if we continue here, for they declare that things shall not be done, for why declare that things shall not be done, which there is no power to do? Hamilton's, well, who said that the federal government could abridge the freedom of speech, right? Why, for instance, should it be said that the liberty of the press shall not be restrained when no power is given by which restrictions may be imposed? I will not contend that such a provision would confer a regulating power, but it is evident that it would furnish to men disposed to usurp a plausible pretense for claiming that power. The truth is, after all, the declamation we have heard that the Constitution is itself, in every rational sense and to every useful purpose, already a Bill of Rights. Right? Why put in a Bill of Rights? Why import this Anglo-European concept that is originally designed for kings and subjects? To quote St. John de Crèvecoeur, author of Letters from an American Farmer, right? He says, Britain has kings and subjects. We have presidents and citizens. If you have a group of citizens, you should not need a Bill of Rights. Now, the Anti-Federalists get the best of this argument. Brutus number 2 is probably, arguably, the most famous. He says, a Bill of Rights is absolutely necessary for the Constitution because the powers, rights, and authority granted to the general government by this Constitution are as complete with respect to every object to which they extend as that of any state government. Right? So this is a very powerful federal government. It is as powerful, if not more powerful, than the state governments. And he says, what do the state governments have? I need say no more, I presume, to be an American, than that this principle is a fundamental one in all the constitutions of our own states. He means the state constitutions here. There is not one of them, but what is either founded on a declaration or Bill of Rights, or has certain express reservation of rights interwoven in the body of them. And he will say later, even in the body of the U.S. Constitution, you have a provision about habeas corpus, about ex post facto laws, about bills of attainder, Don't you already have an unfinished Bill of Rights in the Constitution already, right? So I think this helps us resolve the initial enigma of Patrick Henry. For people that have not thought about this, not read about this, they think of Patrick Henry as this great founding father, very famous during the American Revolution, so yeah, I guess he'd probably be for the Constitution. And they're surprised, but I think we can resolve this enigma now. Patrick Henry, he is a fierce supporter for the Bill of Rights. He says, will the abandonment of your most sacred rights tend the security of your liberty? Liberty, the greatest of all earthly blessings? Give us that precious jewel and you may take everything else. But I fear I have lived long enough to become an old-fashioned fellow. Perhaps an invincible attachment to the dearest rights of men may, in these refined, enlightened days, be deemed old-fashioned. If so, I am contented to be so. So he's saying, am I old-fashioned for wanting a Bill of Rights, for being fiercely attached to liberty? Maybe. And if that's the case, then I will take that. I think we absolutely need a Bill of Rights, is what he's saying. He is obsessed, Henry, with how do you balance power and liberty. And if you were going to give that much liberty to a new constitution, a new federal government, you absolutely have to balance it with a Bill of Rights. James Madison famously capitulates, and he introduces 12 amendments during the first Congress in 1789. The states go on to ratify 10. They take effect in 1791. And these 10 that are ratified of the original 12 are what we now call the Bill of Rights. So, to conclude, why does the ratification debate still matter? I think the best articulation is found in Federalist number 51 by Madison. If not the most famous, at least my favorite. First, Madison says, it may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? There's a saying that goes around political theorists. Tell me what you think about human nature, and I'll tell you what your theory of government is. And this is essentially what Madison is saying. When you're putting together a government, you are thinking deeply about what is human nature. So he says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If everyone was good all the time, maybe you wouldn't need a government. If angels were to govern men, so if you had perfect angelic rulers, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. But here's the rub. Here's the problem. In framing a government which is to be administrated by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, control the people, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. And this is the ongoing debate in American society. Two final quotes from Robert J. Allison. He has a book that he co-edited with the famous historian Bernard Bailyn, The Essential Debate on the Constitution. He has these two great ways of summing up the importance of the ratification debate. He says, in the Revolution's early years, it was easy to denounce power and those who abused it. Very easy for the Americans at the time to look at Britain and say, look at all of the horrible things you're doing to us. But now they had to wield power. It is easy to critique power. It is much harder when you yourself have to wield it responsibly and create a system of power, but also ensure that power would not crush liberty. So over the course of several months, not even 1 year, in an extraordinary philosophical discussion and important political debate, they argued about this. How can you create a power center that will not destroy liberty? That is the absolute crux of the ratification debate. He says, no one had done it before. We are still trying to do it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have one question tonight, and it goes, what do the anti-federalists continue to contribute to discourse today?
Yeah, I think anti-federalists, they continue to give us an entire philosophical mindset, an entire vocabulary derived from the revolution that is skeptical of government power, that is skeptical particularly of federal governments. And as I said in the lecture, my students come in, they think they're going to be all for the Federalists. They're very pro-Constitution. And then they come in and they start to see, oh, actually, maybe the anti-Federalists have a lot of really, really good points. So I think the anti-Federalists are absolutely essential to continuing our political discussion.
All right, thank you. Oh, we have one more.
How close were the votes in the various states when the Constitution was ratified?
It depends on the states. I had a slide actually that looked at the votes, but I did not have time. It depends on the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. How many people are in each state? For instance, you have certain states like New Hampshire that sends it over that is more Federalist. But places like North Carolina, for instance, a lot more anti-Federalist. So you can look those up, but some are closer than others, essentially.
Thank you. That's all we have.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.